We do these calls on occasion when something important has happened and we want to give you a quick briefing on what has happened. When I had a conversation on Saturday with our Executive Vice Chair, former National Security Advisor Steve Hadley, and at the time we decided, Steve, to do this call, we didn't know where it was going to end. We certainly didn't think that it would end in quite the way it did, though we didn't know, and I'm not sure it's really ended. We'll get into all of those questions. But we've done a call like this with Steve and Madeleine Albright in the aftermath of the January 6th attack on the Capitol, with Michael Morrell, Milan Verveer, and Steve after the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan this past summer, and we've done it other times as well. I've talked to the speakers we have today, and they've all agreed that the material that they share with us today can be on the record. We don't have any journalists on the call, but if you'd like to use it, you can. We'll use clips later on as well. Also, for those who will ask questions later, that will potentially be on the record as well, just so everybody understands that. We call what we're doing right now relevance at speed. Our team over the weekend looked at all aspects of this, from the information space to what was going on potentially in Africa, to, of course, what was going on the ground with President Putin and Prigozhin. The crisis seems to be diffused by now, but there's so many unanswered questions that remain. We'll try to dig as deep into those with people who are true experts in the field. So Steve Hadley will kick us off, former National Security Advisor and Chairman of our International Advisory Board, as well Executive Vice Chair of the Council's Board. John Herbst, he's Senior Director of the Eurasia Center, former Ambassador to Ukraine. I was just with him, with our Chairman, John Rogers, in Kiev, talking to President Zelensky, and he'll do a situation report for us. Kersti, Kaljulaid, a former President of Estonia and member of our International Advisory Board, will discuss the regional dynamics and how this will impact the discussion at the upcoming NATO summit in Vilnius in July. And then we have General Wesley Clark and General Curtis Scapparotti, two former NATO Supreme Allied Commanders and members of our board, and they'll share their thoughts from a military perspective. And they've remained incredibly active on all of these areas. And then my favorite analyst on things Russian, Angela Stent, Senior Advisor of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies at Georgetown University. She's written a lot about Putin. She understands the dynamics on the ground, and she'll talk to us about how this will reverberate inside and outside Russia. We'll try to go through these initial speakers relatively quickly, but giving them a chance to go into some depth as well. And then I'll watch for your questions. I've got a screen in front of here. I'm not sure it's as good as my screen in my office of seeing questions in the chat. So what I may do is look for hands up for people who want to ask their questions. That maybe is going to be an easier way to do this. So let me start with Steve. And Steve, I wonder, you know, one of the great pleasures I have in my job is having partners like you on the board who have, in times of crisis, talked to presidents of the United States and told them exactly how they should think about a situation that's unfolding. And obviously how we respond to this is one of the most important questions, but knowing how to respond, first of all, it has to be led by what's going on. And so I'd love to hear a little bit about how you've been working this through your head over the weekend, and were you briefing the President of the United States right now? How might you do that?
Well, thanks, Fred. Thanks all of those of you who have joined this morning. This is a work in progress, a lot of uncertainty. We're through Act 1. We don't know whether this is a 1-act play or a 5-act play. We don't really know the terms of this settlement that has been worked out with Prigozhin, with Putin's blessing. We don't know whether it will be complied with. But even if it turns out to be Act 1 of a 1-act play, this has been an earthquake within the Russian political system, and it's going to take a while for its effects to be clear over time, as it plays out over time. So in light of that, one of the things the president would say would be, well, what are our objectives here? And I think our objectives in this situation are twofold. One, to continue to try to get Russian forces out of Ukraine, and to assure that Ukraine's sovereignty, integrity, and viability as a secure and prosperous state is maintained. And the second objective, I think, is we do not want to encourage a Russian civil war. The consequences of that for regional instability, for refugee flows into our allies, from questions about who controls the nuclear weapons, these are troubling questions that we'd like to avoid. So those would be the objectives. Second question, well, what do you say about this publicly? Because the administration is going to have to talk about it publicly, and I think the statements made over the weekend are pretty close to right. Watching the situation, internal matter to be resolved among the Russians themselves. But I think we should emphasize that it's further evidence that Putin's invasion of Ukraine was a strategic mistake for Russia, that Russia troops should leave Ukraine, whether they're withdrawn or whether it's 1917 style, they put down their arms and they decide to walk home. And because Russia clearly has to attend a lot of internal affairs. That's clear from what we've seen over the week. What to watch for going forward, the President would ask. Well, Putin has clearly been weakened by this. Prigozhin's forces got within something like 150 miles of Moscow. They received tacit support, I would have to say, or at least not active opposition from the Russian security forces. That's a problem for Putin internally, and I would expect you're going to see some purges of his security services and further crackdown internally. His problem is whether he can pull it off. It's a little bit like kids playing with mud pies. Sometimes, you know, the tighter you squeeze, the more mud squeezes out between your fingers. We'll have to see how Putin does. I think the other thing for Putin is he's going to have to try to frustrate the Ukrainian counteroffensive, because the more Ukrainians are able to take back territory from Russian forces, the more Putin looks weak and the more the Ukrainian war looks like, as Prigozhin has been saying, a strategic mistake for Russia. There's a question about Prigozhin. He's got to stay alive. He's been called traitor by Putin. People who are called traitor by Putin don't usually have a very long life expectancy. He's got to decide whether this is over or whether this is Act One of his effort to confront the Minister of Defense, Shoigu, and Gerasimov, the head of Russian chief of the Russian General Staff, and whether he wants to continue this campaign or not, and if so, how he would do it. There's a question about the future of the Wagner group. They're supposed to be either demobilized or brought within the Russian MOD. Will they do that? Will they continue to be a force? If not in Ukraine, what about their continued presence in Africa? A lot of uncertainties there. Questions for Ukraine. This is potentially an opportunity for them to more effectively push their counteroffensive, because if you are already demoralized Russian troops on the front line with Ukraine and you look at what's going on at home, it may make you even less willing to fight. That may be an opportunity for Ukraine. Questions for China. Xi Jinping cannot afford for Putin to go down, and China and Xi may decide that the best way to save Putin is to put pressure on him to bring this war to a close, which has to involve withdrawal of Russian troops. Question of how this affects China. And finally, I would expect the administration to be going around with friends and allies, but particularly with fence sitters around the world, South Africa, Brazil, India, saying, you know, do you really want to be neutral and be perceived as supporting someone who is as weak as Putin? This was a bad bet. Now it's time for you to change your bet. Seems to me those are the things that the president would want to be watching to understand where this is heading over the longer term.
I'm not going to try to impersonate any president of the United States, but that was just a terrific briefing. If you're managing this and looking at the situation on the ground, is it restabilized, or is this a beginning of a long period of instability? Will we see a Game of Thrones where people around Putin see, well, this is a time to move? The way it's been described to me by one really interesting analyst is that there were four sort of power centers. One of them was the FSB, Special Ops, all the troops around there, including the Presidential Guard, which is a very terrific bunch of troops around Putin that he can rely on. The second power is the military, the defense ministry. There's some talk last night that the deal with Prigozhin was that the people he's been criticizing, Shoigu and Gerasimov, will step down. Hard to believe that Putin would actually negotiate that with Prigozhin at a time, a person he called a traitor, but that's what's out there. The third is the Wagner Group. And the Wagner Group has made riches from its work in Africa, but those are also Putin's riches. You know, who do they listen to in Africa right now? Prigozhin, and the fourth is the Chechens. We haven't talked much about the Chechens, but they play a pretty big role, and they probably have many more troops at their behest than just the ones that are under the Ministry of Defense. What we do know is if these are the power pillars, that they've been shaken. That whatever stability there was, however fragile it was, it's shaken. So how unstable does the situation remain? And then, what role does the President of the United States with his allies play in this kind of situation?
Unknown. There are other speakers you're going to get to this morning who are probably better positioned to talk about that than I. I'll give you my take. So why did Putin do this deal 6 or 8 hours after he called Prigozhin a traitor and promised the most draconian kinds of punishment? I think there are probably 3 reasons. One, the progress Prigozhin made moving towards Moscow and the fact that it was really fairly unobstructed. I think and if you look at the preparations that were going on in Moscow, they took this push very seriously. I think that was one reason. Secondly, I think Putin realized that the longer this went on, the more likely Prigozhin's narrative that the Ukraine war was a mistake, that Ukraine did not threaten Russia, and the brotherly relations between Ukrainians and Russians could have been restored without force, the longer Prigozhin has success, the more that narrative might catch on within Russia. And secondly, I think Putin had to worry about schisms and breaches within the security services themselves. Putin has been balancing these various groups you talked about for a long time and fairly effectively. He either didn't see this one coming or didn't step in soon enough. Where this goes depends a little bit on whether Putin regains his footing, is able to do a crackdown and a purge for those that were disloyal, and is able to restore this sort of balancing act that he was doing before. So in some sense, his future is in some measure in his own hands. In terms of the U.S. role, I think the instinct, it's very difficult to know what's going on, and I think our effort to try to affect what's going on from the outside just would justify all kinds of anti-Western, anti-U.S. narratives that Putin has based his rhetorical strategy on. So my guess is the administration would and should stay out of this matter.
Accelerate our help for Ukraine, or just keep it on?
Of course. Yeah. This is the opportunity. This is the opportunity for the Ukrainians to exploit what looks like chaos in Russia and maybe a degraded morale among Russian troops to try to effectively retake Ukrainian territory from Russian forces if they can.
So I'm going to turn next to the views on what is going on inside Russia, since I think Steve got us off to a good start on that. President Kaljulaid of Estonia, where what happens in Russia has a pretty direct and immediate impact on her. So I'd just love to hear how President Kaljulaid has been looking at this over the weekend and in general.
Estonian people have been extremely happy to be watching this time from the front row rather than being on the scene like 30 years ago. But I also have to say that many people, interestingly, even if it is the only happy and military coup in the last century, the one which we witnessed 1991, many are drawing parallels. And many were actually hoping that this will be the end. And people are quite disappointed that it wasn't. But of course, well, things don't go. You don't get this way. You don't get a fairy tale military coup every 30 years in Russia. what is very clear from here is that Putin is now weak, and he is much more perceived to be weak by people inside Russia. And if we were concentrating only on Putin and what he might do, then I think we are overlooking the fact that, I mean, he's not alone. There is a regime what Putin actually is presenting and is representing. But that means this regime is now fully aware that Putin cannot project power, might inside the country. And this is becoming critical. And that is why I think that his days at the helm of Russia are also relatively numbered. But do not be fooled. We might be seeing somebody else there, but it will still be the same regime, which knows very well that Putin has no way out, but Russia and the regime has a way out. And the way out, the logical way out, is that Putin is somehow replaced. Things might happen. I mean, things might naturally happen. Well, this is easy. And they might want then, of course, end the war in Ukraine, but also for us to believe that this is now the new Russia, and therefore start the new cycle, and therefore start to rebuild Russian military forces, having learned from the catastrophe in Ukraine, and continue with their imperialistic ambition. This, for me, is the real danger scenario from Russia now. I'm less worried about Russia turning into a tribal kind of war terrain of domestic war, because, frankly speaking, outside of Prigozhin and Wagner, there doesn't seem to be contenders who would be able to amass such a force and march on Moscow. So if Prigozhin truly is out of the picture, and he might well be out of the picture, alive or soon dead, I do also think that his life expectancy is not long. There simply doesn't seem to be anybody else who would be able to stage this kind of coup. But regime change will not happen, but presenting us a new face might very well happen. And then it's very important that we are not fooled. What concerns Ukraine, then there is nothing better than, continuing our effort and intensifying our effort indeed, so that Ukraine is able to take this opportunity that Russian military command is a little bit at least confused. Keep also in mind, it was said before that Russian military might be actually demotivated by the events. I don't think so. I think that the normal Russian soldier has no access to social media or media online. They're not on phones. Well, very few are. And even if they were, they would not be drawing too many conclusions. So my understanding is that we need to continue and help Ukraine to win this war, because the sooner Russia realizes that it really and truly has lost this war, the regime will try to wriggle out. And then it is for us to be vigilant, not to accept that this is now the new and democratic Russia until we really and truly see changes in Russia. And real change is not what we saw in 1991. Accepting for a change which in reality was which was not change. This is very important, and this is our view from here. Continue towards Vilnius strongly, continue after Vilnius strongly, make sure Ukraine wins, make sure Russians all understand that they are all losing, and then not to be fooled what comes next, and also not to be too afraid of what comes next. Russia is not going to turn into a kind of a tribal competition ground. There will be someone who will replace in a relatively orderly way Putin as we know him, and represent the old regime in a new way. That seems to be what we here in the front row are thinking collectively. Thank you.
Good statement.
Thank you, President Kaljulaid. As you were watching this on Saturday, what did you think was going to be the best outcome for Estonia, and where do you think you are right now?
I'm afraid it might be the best outcome. Russian people are starting to realize Putin is weak, but they were given a time period to decide what to do about it. Because indeed, if things had unraveled very quickly like they did in 1991, and we would be looking at somebody taking the power in Russia today, not Prigozhin, I think he was only able to create disturbances, but somebody else would have stepped into the void and taken responsibility. Then we would be already in the position which I am personally and many Estonians are most fearing. And this our Far East, everybody in the West again believes this is the new Russia. But it would not have been. It would have been the same Russia with a new face in front of it. So right now, the current outcome that we all know Putin is weakened and we can prepare ourselves is much better. So we are not, well, of course, we are worried. We also stepped up our border controls and everything. But I think we need to stay the course and focus more on what we can do in Ukraine, how we can help Ukraine to benefit from this situation. But I mean, nothing massively changed.
NATO membership in July, would you move that fast? Maybe not give it there, but the roadmap. How should this change anything at the Vilnius summit in July?
Precisely not. I mean, this is what we have been saying from this corner of the world. Let's do what is right. And let's stop guessing what is going on and what will happen thereafter in Russia and with Russia. Let's do what is right. And we've heard hopeful noises also, for example, from France on this subject a few days ago, before even this occasion. Nothing has changed in this sense.
President Kaljulaid, it's an honor to have you on our International Advisory Board, and thank you for giving us that close-up view. So, Angela, you've been following this leader of Russia for a long time. Love to hear your situation report, what you think is going on. Is this just the beginning of a Game of Thrones that we're going to see? Is this the beginning of the end of Putin, or what is your take on all this?
When I look at just what happened on Saturday, I think of the title of Peter Pomerantz's book, "Nothing is True and Everything is Possible." So what we saw happening doesn't compute for me, because you had Yevgeny Prigozhin starting off in the last week telling the Russian people that the war was unnecessary, that Ukraine didn't threaten them, and the reason why Russia went to war with Ukraine is because Russian oligarchs wanted to get their hands on Ukrainian assets. Then what Wagner was facing, obviously, was its dissolution, and the Ministry of Defense saying that the Wagner fighters had to join the regular armed forces. So that clearly was not to his liking. His forces had done so much of the fighting in Bakhmut. Then you see him go to Rostov, and he was the Wagner troops were really welcomed there, they were like heroes. Then you have Putin giving this, very angry speech on Saturday morning, likening what was happening to 1917, to the beginning of the Russian Civil War, to the intervention by Western powers in Russia at that time, saying that the Wagnerites were traitors and that they had to be brought to justice. And then you have the march on Moscow. You have, Prigozhin stopping within 200 kilometers, and then you suddenly have this announcement by Dmitry Peskov, the press secretary, not by Putin or any one of his colleagues, that an agreement had been reached and that Prigozhin wasn't going to be tried. He wasn't, he could go to Belarus, and the same would be true for the Wagner troops. I think there were, in the end, about 8,000 of them who had followed him or would have gone to Moscow. It doesn't really make any sense at all. We haven't seen any of Putin's close colleagues publicly support him. Radio silence in Moscow. We had a video today of the defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, allegedly in Ukraine. I'm not sure that anyone has verified that that was from today and not from, sometime last week or sometime a few weeks ago. Clearly, one of the major demands that Prigozhin has made was that both Shoigu and Valery Gerasimov, the chief of the general staff, should be fired. As far as we know, they haven't been fired. So one has to wonder what it was that Prigozhin got for agreeing to stand down and not go to Moscow. One suspects that he was maybe waiting for more support indications of support in Moscow. We don't know if he had a plan about what he would have done had he gotten to Moscow. So, and we do know that, Wagner has been very closely related to the GRU, the military intelligence, but there are now people also saying that the FSB was somehow also involved to some extent supporting him. There's so much that we don't know, but I think what we can say is that Putin certainly does look weaker than he did before that, and the fact that the message that Prigozhin has sent has clearly fallen on fertile ground among some of the Russians, even though the public opinion polls show, if you believe them, that a majority of the people still support this war. I think there's certainly more questions. And because we haven't seen anything from any of his colleagues, in supporting him, we have really no clue about what's going on there. But I certainly agree that the war in Ukraine will go on. I'm not sure that this necessarily benefits the Ukrainians at this point. I'm going to be very interested to hear what our other colleagues have to say about that. But clearly, the war should, the West should continue supporting Ukraine, and we'll wait and see if there's any change. I think most of us believed before this happened that Putin believed that he could wait the West out, that our unity would weaken, and that, if he waits to the end of the year, the beginning of next year, and who knows what's going to happen in the U.S. elections, that would be to his advantage. I'm not really sure whether he can really believe that anymore. I think there should be a big question mark. But however, I think if this is the beginning of the unraveling of his regime, it's probably not going to happen quickly. Having said that, of course, anyone who studies Russia knows that you can be surprised. It may be a slower process, but one just does have to assume that this erodes, some of the support that he has. But he still has his own National Guard, the Rosgvardia. He's got 300,000 troops that are allegedly loyal to him. So it's not as if he's left without any support. So maybe I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, Angela. And let me do a first round through these speakers and then turn to the incredible people, lots of experts also on the line. Before I turn to our two 4-stars, General Clark and General Scapparotti, John Herbst, can you give us what your situation report is right now? Maybe you can pick up from Angela's standpoint on, what this potentially changes on the ground in Ukraine. On the one hand, Putin looks weak. The troops have to question whether they want to die right now for this leader in this country in a time where they've just seen what happened over the weekend. On the other hand, you have Prigozhin in Belarus, and there are some rumors that maybe he could open up a new front in Belarus, which would be a great problem for Ukraine. But does Putin really embrace what a person he's called a traitor, opening up a new front? I really love Angela's quote, "Nothing is true and everything is possible." I guess that's right, but if you can help us dissect this, John, and tell us what's true and what's possible.
I would agree with virtually everything Angela said. I would underscore, though, that this is certainly a sign of A, Putin's weakness, and B, fissures in the Putin regime. Things that have been evident, albeit much less clear to people who don't follow it closely, since last October, when the extent of the success of Ukraine's 2022 counteroffensive became clear, and Prigozhin began, with some help from Kadyrov, going after Gerasimov and Shoigu. But Prigozhin became increasingly louder, and already about 2.5 months ago, he gave a peculiar speech in which he foreshadowed his clear criticism of the war in Ukraine and the unjustifiable pretext for that war. So this has all been building, again, since last fall. And Angela's right, we don't know what the senior power players in Moscow have been doing and thinking. We do know, however, that this is truly Putin's war, and very few people, including among his Siloviki closest pals, wanted this big invasion. And everyone understands that Russia has paid a large price for this, as has Putin's regime. The interesting thing about Prigozhin is saying this publicly with, at this point, no pushback. One more small indicator of perhaps the continuing weakening of the Putin regime. There's a member of the Duma, think tanker as well, Sergei Markov, who's a very reliable indicator of people who are close to Putin, or rather want to be close to Putin, and are trying to position themselves for the future. He's had several Telegram posts this morning, essentially saying that Russian spinmeisters are putting out the following instructions for explaining what happened, such as it's all over, this demonstrates the stability and the wisdom of the Putin regime. The fact that he's putting that out suggests he's trying to hedge. He doesn't think that the regime is doing that well. And I think that's true. Now, what's going on in Ukraine in the war? At an absolute minimum, this is a plus for Ukrainians because the already demoralized Russian soldiers have one more reason to be demoralized. Also, and this actually predates the coup attempt, Wagner's essentially pulled out of the fight after it, quote unquote, took Bakhmut several weeks ago. And Wagner, whatever its liabilities, remains the most potent force fighting on the field in Ukraine. So them being at least partly out of the fight is important. If now they're going to meekly go into the Ministry of Defense to become part of the regular Russian military, they will be notably less effective. They're not going to strengthen the already demoralized troops. They will just become part of the morass. So this is another plus for Ukraine. As for what we should do, I mean, my views have not been hidden. I think we should be stronger than we've been for the last several years. That predates Biden, though it includes Biden. And I think that we should be sending the weapons Ukraine needs to ensure that they can break the land bridge in the next 6 months. So far, the administration's not willing to go there. Maybe this will help them move in that direction. We should also be planning for a much more robust Vilnius NATO summit than Washington seems to be interested in, although the White House has been embarrassed by me behind most of the allies now, including the French, regarding NATO Ukraine. And they're trying to come up with something, and hopefully they'll come up with more than they were planning a few weeks ago. One major part of the debate on our policy towards Ukraine and Russia has been what I consider to be the well-played by the Kremlin Putin nuclear bluff. The Russians have spent 20 years building the elaborate metaphor of Putin as the rat in the corner who would lash out if cornered. Well, we just saw what the rat in the corner does when he was confronted with a flying column heading towards Moscow. He headed for the tall grass. This should also inform our understanding of what Putin might do if Ukraine were to take the land bridge. In other words, I don't think we have to worry about. We always have to take into account the possibility of, but we should not be intimidated by his increasingly hollow nuclear threats. Thank you.
I think we'll hear more from that from General Clark and General Scapparotti. Let me just go back to Angela for 1 minute, because I think you're the one on this call that can tell us the most about fissures in the Putin regime. And I know it's opaque, I know it's hard to figure out, but one one's hearing, as you said, people were silent yesterday. So one didn't hear from the head of intelligence, Narishkin, one didn't really hear from Patrushev in any way. And you can explain to the people on the line who these people are, Angela. Does jockeying begin now among these people? What do we know, and what's your reading of the silence? I mean, obviously you didn't have troops in Rostov-on-Don stopping Prigozhin. So as you've watched the Kremlin for a long time, this is almost more complicated to figure out, but what are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, it really is a black box. I mean, we certainly know, I'm not talking about the very inner circle. We certainly know that there are significant numbers of people among the elite who are very dissatisfied with what's been happening, not the least because they can't travel to Europe or the US or wherever. They can't visit their bank accounts in their homes. And, they thought that they were part of this globalized elite, and now they're stuck in Russia and sanctioned, many of them. And I think that was very evident even at the St. Petersburg International Economic Economic Forum a couple of weeks ago how different it was from what it used to be before this war began. Now, having said that, a lot of those people understand that they can't leave, and have been told that, so they're stuck. But as for Putin's very inner circle, we really don't know very much about that at all. I mean, that is Nikolai Patrushev, the head of his Security Council, probably the heads also of the Foreign and Domestic Intelligence Services, the SVR and the FSB, and then there are people who are close friends of Putin who don't have official jobs in the administration, like Yuri Kovalchuk, who owns one of the big banks there. Those are the people, and probably Igor Sechin, who is the head of Rosneft, and those are the people he talks to. There has been some speculation when people talk about a potential successor to Putin. People go back now to Mr. Kiriyenko, who was actually prime minister briefly in 1999 and now is an enthusiastic supporter of the war and has a much more public profile. And there are a few younger governors whose names pop up as potential successors, but of course, until now, Putin hasn't wanted to be a lame duck, and therefore he clearly hasn't named that. But again, I come back to the fact that none of the people who hold these positions, and including the Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin, who's been very, very quiet really since the war began, but none, and who would, by the way, if something happened to Putin, he would actually succeed him for the first few months until there was an election. But none of these people, have come out and supported him. So I wouldn't be able to come up with a name for you, but I would say if there's an orderly succession, then you would still have someone coming to power who shares Putin's views. If there's some discontinuity, then that could all change. But if there's an orderly one, it would be a similar regime. Now, would it continue to prosecute the war in Ukraine? I mean, that's a huge question. Or it might decide that it wanted to think about ways of getting out and saving face. But we really know very little about all of this, just because it's the people who surround him are mainly from the intelligence services, and they know how to suppress information.
Thank you, Angela. So General Clark first and General Scapparotti, let's do this round. I'm going to start watching my screen for the hands that are up for questions from all of you, and questions and comments, because I see we've got some pretty substantial experts on the line listening in as well. General Clark.
Well, the first thing is to make sure the Russian soldiers know what's happened so they can be demoralized. One of the things the Russian forces have done is take away the mobile communications from their soldiers when they reach a certain point on the battlefield. So the Ukrainians have been running information operations for some time. They've been encouraging Russian soldiers to surrender, threatening them, doing other things. They need to intensify those information operations now, make sure that they take advantage of this situation to exact the most demoralization they can from the Russian forces that they're facing. Secondly, got to understand that these Ukrainian forces are facing a huge problem with minefields. The whole front virtually the whole front is mined. They've got to find a way through it. That's slow, it's painstaking, and we didn't give them sufficient equipment to do this. In particular, they need more mine clearing line charges, probably by a factor of 10. The only way you're going to get through this is to blow your way through it. You can't have a soldier on his belly with a knife probing for mines and expect to really make a breakthrough on this. And you can't put your mine clearing tanks up front in broad daylight or even at night and think you can drill a path through this. These are really deep minefields. They can be reinforced with artillery delivered mines and have been. So this is the significant problem. Third thing is we need to continue to push equipment to the Ukrainians. In particular, they need 155 artillery systems, not just the ammunition, the systems. They're in a tough counter-fire fight with Russian artillery. They started the fight outnumbered. They're now perhaps on a par in terms of being able to return shell for shell, but when they take losses, they can't fix it. They have to, if it's Western, they have to send it out. So they need more tubes. You cannot advance against this kind of a defense without winning the counterfire battle. They need more air defense that's available to protect mobile forces. We need to give them ATACMs right away, and we don't need to announce it. We just need to put it in there. It's fired from the same launcher, minimal train up, put a few hundred systems in there, and let's get rid of the Russian reserves and the Russian artillery positions that can be detected. Are we giving the Ukrainians real-time battlefield intelligence? The latest, what I believe is we're not, but the Brits are, and I guess they're taking ours. Can we do anything to focus this and get the information down to the individual units that are trying to breach these minefields? If we go back and look at our imagery records, we know exactly where the defenses are, when they were put in, what was put in there. It doesn't do any good to have it published in the Financial Times. It has to be down at the tank crewman level, down to 6-digit grid coordinates. So if we haven't done that, we need to do that. So those would be the immediate things on the battlefield. Where did Prigozhin's forces go? Now, the newspapers say that we saw this buildup happening. Well, if we saw the buildup happening, surely we've got listening devices in there. We can hear who's talking. We know who they are. What are they saying? We're not hearing anything from national sources on this. I hope we know where they went. Is Prigozhin really going to Belarus? Is he going to really link up with the nuclear warheads that are there? Is he going to run a coup against Lukashenko? Has this all been a kabuki dance? Probably not. But could they make something of it later? Maybe. I'd say the chances are remote on that. I think it's 90% what you see is what there was. A weak chain of command, no real support for Putin, and the Russian military in the field being vulnerable. But if we don't get that information down to the individual soldier on the Russian side and erode his confidence in his chain of command, then all this talk at high levels about Putin being weak and so forth doesn't affect the military situation on the ground. Final point, if I were Ukraine, I would strengthen my observation of what's going on the border with Belarus. You just never know. Thank you.
General Clark, thank you for that. I think this underscoring of Belarus, I mean, watching Belarus might be the real place where we figure out what this Prigozhin, quote unquote, truce is all about. If I want to go into exile, I'm probably not going to do it in Belarus.
Fred, if I could just say one more thing.
Yes, please.
Picking up on what John Herbst said, we've got to get Ukraine into NATO, and this looking around for security guarantees that will let us avoid this. It's like we want to hold back the NATO decision to use it as a bargaining chip with Putin. Surely what we've seen here is that Putin is weak. Put it out that Ukraine will join NATO next year, create some conditions, and if Putin wants to come forward and preemptively surrender rather than have NATO come into Ukraine, good. But use the bargaining chip the correct way, not by looking weak, but by looking strong and showing strength to Russia.
So, General Scapparotti, why don't you pick up from there? The Belarus question was really interesting. Certainly the one I'm going to watch very closely. But I could argue this both ways, that this is a time to really double down in supporting Ukraine because there's a moment of weakness, move forward. There are some in the administration that would say, no, that could trigger a response, nuclear or otherwise, where out of desperation Putin does something really truly crazy. I don't know where you come down on that, but also your overall situation analysis. General Scapparotti.
Yeah, thanks, Fred. And it's a pleasure to be a part of this and particularly to listen to the expertise among this group here. Starting with that, I would just tell you throughout this time, I've been one that believed that our administration has been too timid in terms of it. I mean, I respect the leadership within NATO and what we have done for Ukraine, and that we've been focused on that. But I think we've been too cautious in what we provided Ukraine and when we provided it, i.e. doing it in somewhat of a incremental way. So because of that, I think this is a real opportunity. And now's the time to make sure the Ukrainians have what they need and they get it quickly. I agree with General Clark absolutely on that. I think we've just done this in too slow of a fashion. So now's the time to show strength, and now's the time to reinforce them. I would be less concerned about provocation. From my point of view, Putin's in a very, very bad spot right now with lots of problems. I don't think that supporting Ukraine at this point, exploiting the situation, certainly being aware of indicators, but I don't believe that that's a reason for extreme concern. I would also say that this has got to be undermining the Russian troops' morale. Certainly, they don't have full access, but I'm sure the command and them know that there's things happening, and we have ways within information operations to make sure we get that out. And I would certainly be working those aspects of it, and I hope that we're helping the Ukrainians be effective at that. And if I were the Ukrainians, I would exploit this as much as I possibly could. One of the things that I wonder about, we just don't know. There's a lot that we don't know, which has been said, but it's interesting to me as this thing unraveled that, typically the Russians put their private armies or commercial armies, if you will, under their intelligence apparatus, under the FSB or those. And that's what they've done throughout history. And so for this to occur, and not see more of a response than we did, even over the indicators over the past couple of weeks, is really surprising to me. And that leads me to believe that there's a lot that we don't know about what's going on. I was also surprised that Putin didn't react as quickly as one might expect. So I think there's a lot that we don't know yet, and certainly watching it closely. But on the part of the United States, being also somewhat cautious in our response. Let's wait and see how this unrolls in terms of policy. Having said that, I also would probably be in contact with China to see what their thoughts are on this, and leverage that for their assistance, because it's just another indicator that this is a strategic mistake by Putin. And I'll end there. Thanks.
Do you have anything to say, General Scapparotti, on what their response was over the weekend to China? And maybe Steve knows as well, but I thought it was very interesting. I think they have a foreign minister in Moscow right now, if I'm not mistaken. Steve, do you want to speak to that quickly, how China is looking at this?
I don't think we know. I think China's initial reaction from what I've seen in the press, and that's my only sources, has been very cautious. I think they're in a little watching and waiting. But this can't be reassuring to Xi to see his life partner, have a column get within 150 miles of Moscow. So I think this is an opportunity for the administration to get China to double down on a potential effort to pressure Putin to bring this war to an end in a way that involves getting Russian troops out of Ukraine. Because that's in a way the way you save Putin at this point in time, and I hope the administration is making that argument to the Chinese.
Thank you, Steve. Anything on that, General Scapparotti?
No, nothing more on that.
Okay. So we scheduled this for an hour and a half because I think we anticipated the depth of these opening comments and also the wealth of knowledge that's outside of the speakers that's on the line. So I'll turn to Brian Kelly first, and then Joe Nye, and then General Jones are lined up. And among the speakers, if it's a question, say who you want to address it to, but obviously his comments are fair game as well. And then on the speakers, if you want to intervene at some point, then put up your hand as well, so that I know you'd like to do that. So Brian.
Thanks, Fred, and always phenomenal conversation. I mean, General Scapparotti, you kind of touched on a little bit of my question, but how should we be thinking about the EU, US, and China coordinating on a response? You talked about the caution, and I appreciate that comment, but is there some coordination on leverage between the three kind of legs of the stool? And if there is coordination, does that actually create a counter reaction from Putin kind of lashing out as in a corner? So I'd be curious about that thought process. Thank you.
General Scapparotti, I think that was to you, and the other speakers want to speak to what they can.
Sure. Brian, I think that should occur, and I think it's in the manner in which it's approached as to how Putin reacts to that. I think it's of value to collaborate like that, and I think a message that from the three could be powerful from those entities for Putin, informing him. And again, I think part of that is how is it messaged to him? What's the message? And I think there's ways to do that could be helpful. All along, I believe that the United States bringing together as many countries as we can to message the stance is always the best route.
Thank you. Joe Nye.
Thanks, Fred. And I wanted to pick up your point about Belarus and ask Angela a question. And the question is, what, if anything, did we learn from the weekend's events about Lukashenko and his role? I mean, the conventional wisdom has been that Lukashenko was Putin's puppet. On the other hand, if he has alliances with other factions, and Putin has been weakened, he may have more leeway for Belarusian policy than before. Among those questions is he able or even willing to protect Prigozhin? Otherwise, I think the earlier comment that I wouldn't want to write the insurance policy on Prigozhin life stands. So what do you think about Belarus and Lukashenko?
And Angela, I might add to that is, can we accept at face value that Lukashenko was the mediator who brought this home?
So thank you for the question, Joe. I mean, I would also caution, we were told that Lukashenko was negotiating all day on Saturday with Prigozhin, and maybe that's true. One reason why he might have been given that role is because if something goes wrong, then Putin himself wouldn't get the blame for it. They could always blame Lukashenko if there are things that don't go the way they want them to do. Otherwise, it's difficult to see because until now we've seen Lukashenko in a very subordinate position to Putin. He's totally dependent on Putin for staying in power. And therefore, it was surprising to think that he would take any initiative like that. We don't, and this has already been mentioned, we don't know whether Prigozhin really is in Belarus or not. I mean, there was a cryptic message yesterday on his internet platform from Wagner saying that he would communicate with people when he had better cell phone service, which is pretty funny because that raises the question of, why he doesn't have better cell phone service now. So I don't have a good answer to this. I can't imagine that there would be any kind of an alliance between Lukashenko and Prigozhin. It's already been raised the question of, would Prigozhin be using Belarus as a way of, going back with his soldiers into Ukraine? But I doubt that because I think they want to dissolve Wagner. The Russian MOD does. So I'm not sure what its future is there. So I don't have a very good answer for you, I'm afraid.
News just coming in, breaking 2 minutes ago, Prigozhin, and this is in the FT, Prigozhin denies trying to overthrow the Russian government. And the truth is, all he said was he wanted to have the defense minister and he wanted Gerasimov and Shoigu replaced. He never said he wanted, in fact, he didn't talk about Putin at all on Saturday. But Steve, I know you wanted to comment on how the talks unfolded.
Well, look, Angela's better positioned on this. I will just say what the press was saying over the weekend in answer to Joe's question. One, Lukashenko said that he spoke with Putin before he undertook this role with Prigozhin. And secondly, Angela, I saw a press report that said that Lukashenko was supported by Putin's chief of staff and by the Russian ambassador to Belarus. So while he was the figurehead, I'm not sure he was a disinterested third party negotiating this. Seems to me more he was doing it on instructions and with coaching from Putin forces. But that's just press reports. You would know better than I.
No, I think that's quite possible. I'm sure Putin was involved in this, but for whatever reason, he wanted Lukashenko to be the public face of the negotiation.
Right. Terrific. General Jones, and I think then John Herbst wants to also come in on one of the questions. So, General Jones.
Thank you. I think one of the big issues as a result of this is the issue of whether Ukraine should join NATO now or later. Prior to this, I think prior to this event, I think the consensus was that the NATO membership would come later, although there'd be some affirmation at Vilnius that it would come and some guarantees. But in view of Putin's weakness at this point, I would think that this is a matter that would be openly discussed as to the timing of NATO membership. Second, to General Clark and General Scapparotti's comments on getting the Ukrainians the arms that they need, I completely agree that it should be now and as quickly as possible. And then I think another question is, what's the future of the Wagner group? And what are they going to do? And I don't think that's been resolved yet. And Belarus's role, I think, is worthy of waiting to see what happens there. I can't imagine that an exile into Belarus with whatever guarantees Putin or Lukashenko may have given Prigozhin would have much value. I think Prigozhin's life expectancy in Belarus would be quite short. And lastly, I completely agree with the point that we should really engage with China on this as much as we can as these things go on, because I'm sure the President Xi is watching this unfold with asking himself a lot of questions about the future that China might contemplate on Taiwan. Thank you.
Thank you, General Jones. Having three former Supreme Allied Commanders Europe on the line is always a useful thing to discuss a moment like this. John Herbst, and by the way, John was our former ambassador to Ukraine and Uzbekistan, as well as being the leader of our Eurasia Center. John.
Regarding Prigozhin in Belarus, whoever took the initiative, whether it was Lukashenko trying to get some leverage or the Kremlin seeking to use Lukashenko, this is kind of a coup for him. Since his failed election, which he claimed himself president of despite the results in 2020, he has become more and more under Putin's control. So this may give him a little bit of a standing to push back. But Prigozhin in Belarus is going to be under Putin's control in some fashion. A lot of people are speculating that he is not long for this world. And that's possible because Putin looks weak for having allowed Prigozhin to get out of this mess after he launched the coup. But there's a good reason for Putin not to take him down, because Prigozhin remains a figure of some popularity and legitimacy in Russia. And while Putin could try and do this, you might say, behind closed doors, everyone will assume that it's him. And I think Putin has to worry about that.
Thank you for that. President Kaljulaid, I wonder, you're closer to Belarus than any of us are. How do you look at the situation in Belarus, Prigozhin going there, and the whole role that Lukashenko could end up playing, or Prigozhin could end up playing, on that long border that Belarus has with Ukraine?
Frankly, don't think Lukashenko is playing any important role here in this game. I'm quite sure that he was not the initiator and he was not the negotiator. He was chosen as someone who could offer immediately the problem. And to resolve immediately the problem was indeed to get Prigozhin somehow out of the way. I definitely don't think that any promises given to him relating to Shoigu or Gerasimov will be kept. And definitely he's just put aside. And then those people who really decide, they will think about how to handle this situation. Whether Prigozhin's 25,000 soldiers will even follow him to the region, which is now indicated in Belarus, where they would have a new camp, I have serious doubts. Many might actually go back to Syria and to Africa, and some might take up the opportunity to join the regular army. But those who will go there, I don't see them anymore as a risk to Ukraine after what Prigozhin has been saying. That, I mean, this war was a mistake. It is just serving Shoigu. It is serving the Russian oligarchs who is enriching themselves. So I do think Lukashenko is a pawn. And I do think that Prigozhin will face his fate rather sooner than later. Thank you.
Thank you for that, President Kaljulaid. It's interesting that you now have Prigozhin putting out a statement, an audio statement, but neither Putin nor Prigozhin has appeared publicly. In fact, we don't even really know where Prigozhin is, but they haven't appeared publicly since all of this was, to a certain extent, resolved. So that's an interesting situation. We have Ambassador Ramayat.
Sorry to come in, but Putin has appeared. Putin has appeared today. Whether it's really a video from today, but he has appeared today speaking to some kind of young scientists of Russia or something. But he didn't mention even the attempted coup or Prigozhin in his speech. But he has appeared today.
Interesting, very useful. So I'm looking for more questions and comments. I'd love to have, if somebody could give me the potential impact on Africa. The Wagner Group's playing an outsized role there. The troops, are they listening to Prigozhin? Is he still their commander? Is Putin their commander? Ramayad, who runs our Africa Center, wrote about this some yesterday, but I don't think we actually know how that's going to unfold. But there are knock-on impacts all over the world on this. I don't know whether, Steve, you have any thoughts on the Africa front, or any one of our speakers or attendees, and I'll look as well for other questions.
Well, I'll be filler, and hopefully someone who really knows something about Africa will step in. I think part of it is the money. It's been a terrific source of income for Prigozhin and supporting his forces. And the question is whether people will decide this is now up for grabs. I suspect Putin is already getting his cut. The question is whether others will want some kind of cut. Don't know. There's a question of, when we talk about incorporating the Wagner Group into the MOD, does that include the forces in Africa? Because for the moment, Putin and Russia have been basically one step behind and had a certain amount of deniability. Do they really want to take explicit responsibility for what the Wagner troops have been doing in Africa? So I think there are a lot of questions. I'm with General Jones. Don't think we know the answer at this point in time, but others who may be closer to it than I, please raise your hand and bail me out here.
It's my understanding that, Steve, that to make the force that they had in Ukraine, the Wagner Group brought a lot of their troops out of Africa to the Ukraine to make that robust force. So again, I'm not completely sure what's going on in Africa, but I think I think I heard from credible sources that they pulled a lot of their troops back in order to make up the force.
Interesting.
Interesting.
John.
Thank you so much for that. Let me turn to Angela Stent and then John Herbst. Angela.
Yeah, just to add to this, I mean, Wagner has become a very important arm of the Russian state in terms of projecting its influence, particularly on the African continent. It owns, Wagner owns very lucrative gold and diamond and other precious minerals assets in the Central African Republic. In other parts of Africa, it's very active in Sudan, in a number of places. And I think, as you intimated, Steve, it's not only that Prigozhin and the other commanders benefit from this financially, but so does the Kremlin. I mean, we know that. So I would find it very hard to believe that they're going to suddenly dismantle Wagner, particularly at this time when the Russian regular forces are fighting in Ukraine, and have someone else take over their activities in Africa. So I think this is something to watch very carefully. Will they continue doing what they're doing there? And they've expanded their activities in the last year. Or is there going to be another big struggle, because we're talking about huge assets and then the support of a number of authoritarian leaders there who are very dependent on Moscow.
So Angela, what are the odds that we're actually not going to have a permanent break at all between Putin and Prigozhin? Putin said things about Prigozhin on Saturday, but Prigozhin said nothing critical about Putin at all. And today he's just sent out this statement that says, hey, look, they killed 30 of my fighters. I wasn't trying to overtake the government. I'm just trying to keep my troops intact and fighting. And I wasn't going, more or less said I wasn't going after Putin at all. I know a lot of this is speculation, as you said earlier, but they've been awfully close for awfully long. Is this really the breaking point between the two of them, or not?
Yeah, so Prigozhin did criticize Putin a few weeks ago indirectly. He talked about the war not going well, and then about, quote unquote, the happy grandfather who's a little bit removed from reality. So this was seemed to be a gentle criticism of Putin. Yeah, I'm not sure that there will be a break between them. And they have been dependent on each other. And, we get back to the question, there are obviously great tensions within the inner circle there and between the Ministry of Defense and other groups. We'll just have to wait and see. I mean, we might see Prigozhin now recant and then come back to the field, or, he could meet with an unfortunate accident any day.
John Herbst.
Angela preempted most of what I wanted to say. I was just going to add that first, there's also significant Wagner presence in Syria and in Libya, and that apparently is not changed in recent weeks. And as Angela pointed out, there are vested interests, both commanders in the field and others, who profited from Wagner's activities in the Middle East and in Africa. And chances are those activities will continue. They'll just make sure that Prigozhin's hands are not on them.
General Jones, go ahead.
I'd be curious from our panelists to hear whether they think that the NATO issue for Ukraine is one that should be advanced, or what's the feeling about going into Vilnius about NATO membership for Ukraine now that this has happened?
Oh, was it President Kaljulaid? Do you want to comment on that?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. Everything what we can do to fast forward the messaging towards Russia, they are really losing. They are losing everything on every ground. This is what we need to do. And therefore, the clearer the message Ukraine will join NATO, the better. There is no other way forward to drive home to Russians, to ordinary Russians, that they really are losing. Thank you.
I completely agree with that.
So, President Kaljulaid, how do you navigate the following, and maybe Steve, having been involved in the 2008 issue of Ukraine's membership, can comment on this as well. The argument is that you can't bring a country into NATO where part of it is occupied or it's at war with somebody. On the other hand, all that does is reinforce Putin's position to continue to occupy and to continue to be at war. And I just wonder if there's some sort of workaround here where where we don't give him the wrong incentives. So President Kaljulaid first, and then Steve Hadley.
I'm quite sure that whatever linguistic acrobatics we would use, I mean, the Russia will understand our intent. Either we will continue, we will help Ukraine to get rid of partial occupation, and we will help Ukraine to join NATO. We don't need to be specific about what will be the conditions, what will be the time frame, but I think we need to be very clear that we see Ukraine in NATO when they have restored their territorial integrity, but also pointing out that history knows occasions when countries have joined having been partially occupied or broken, like, for example, Germany. So I don't think that trying to be particularly nimble with the words will help. Russians will get the message one way or the other. One message is we are weak, we are afraid, and the other message is we are strong and we will persevere and we will make this happen for Ukraine in a safe time frame, in a safe format. And there is no third way, I believe. So, and my feeling is that in Europe for months, thinking also back to discussions which we've had here in Europe for a couple of months, there has been also in Germany and in France kind of coming to the common conclusion, which is not publicly mentioned yet, but there is no other way that Ukraine has to be within NATO. Thank you.
Thank you. Steve.
Well, you're putting me on the spot. This is, one of the lessons I think I would draw from our experience in 2008 at Bucharest, where we, on the one hand, and the Germans and the French split on this issue of membership action plan for Ukraine and Georgia. I think rather than being a provocation for Putin, it was an opportunity for Putin, because he saw that the French and the Germans were really unalterably opposed to any near-time consideration of membership for Ukraine, and he took that as an opportunity. It is interesting that the only two countries Putin has invaded, Georgia and Ukraine, in this neighborhood are the ones that are not in NATO. So I think it actually was an opportunity. But the lesson for it is that whatever comes out of Vilnius has to be unified. We cannot have a split between one group of allies and another. It would be, I think, present another opportunity for Putin, but more it might undermine the existing steadfast and I think very strong consensus between the United States and Europe for support for Ukraine. So I think that's the risk. So it's got to be one in consensus. And there will be those in the administration who will say that if we move forward with NATO membership for Ukraine in any way now, it will bail Putin out because it will be justify and seem to validate his notion that he is defending Russia against a NATO moving eastward. I don't agree with that. I think we're going to have to, and some of you who write op-eds on this subject, I think need to answer that argument. There's a proposal that Sandy Vershbow and Ian Brzezinski did that basically said you would upgrade the current relationship between NATO and Ukraine. You would set a timetable for the next NATO summit to develop two things. One, a robust plan for readying Ukraine for NATO membership, and separately supporting and institutionalizing acceleration of support militarily for Ukraine, so by that same NATO date it is in a position as best as it can to defend itself by itself, which is the commitment we've really given to Israel. I think there's something there, and it also puts a time out there where we would consider firmly bringing Ukraine into NATO. I think something like that may be able to get a consensus within the alliance, but I do think we need a consensus. We don't need a falling out among U.S. and the European allies at this point on anything over Ukraine. That's the best I can do.
Thank you, Steve. Ahmad Orn.
Hi, it's not an immediate matter, but just a quick thought. Would Turkey approve Ukraine's NATO membership?
Well, you can answer that for us, Ahmad. You're there.
I'm not going to do that.
Well, Turkey approves the Swedish membership, right? They've approved Finland. I don't know.
I have my opinions,
but
but
the
I would
interesting
like to
part
hear.
of this, the interesting part of this summit, is how does all of this affect Putin's relationship with Erdogan, which is incredibly close, and is certainly part of the reason why he's been dragging his feet on NATO's membership for Sweden. But that's a really interesting
on Saturday, Erdogan publicly announced his support to Putin.
Yeah.
Over the Wagner movement.
Yeah. Does anyone online have an answer to the Sweden question? General Clark, General Scapparotti? You know, actually, why don't I go for a final round, starting with you, General Scapparotti? You can answer this, but in this final round, we're down to the last 10 minutes, maybe 30 seconds for everybody. What are you watching now? I mean, this is a difficult situation to sort out, and maybe you can share with people what you're going to watch in the next few days. I'm certainly going to watch whether the Chief of Staff Gerasimov and the Secretary of Defense Shoigu stay in power. And I'm going to watch where Prigozhin appears and what Putin and Prigozhin say about each other. So those are two things I'm going to watch. General Scapparotti, General Clark, let me turn to the two of you first, and then I'll go in reverse order that we started.
Yeah, thank you, Fred. Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I'd certainly watch the leadership. I'm surprised, frankly, that Shoigu and Gerasimov have stayed in position as long as they can. So I think to see how this shakes out with them, given that Prigozhin's attacks have been directed primarily at them throughout this time. The second thing is just watching the responsiveness of their chain of command and their troops, and what we can learn about their performance and their response to this. What do they know? I think that will be quite interesting.
Yeah, I think watching the troops on the ground, the Russian troops on the ground, Ukraine, obviously interesting thing. General Clark.
I agree with all that. I think it's very strange that we haven't heard anything about the people, the troops in Rostov. And they surrendered their garrison to Prigozhin. Is that going to be acceptable, or are they going to be punished for that? And again, we've got to locate those Wagner troops. Where are they? What are they doing? And where is Prigozhin? What is his plan? So those are the things I'd be wanting.
Thank you.
I would say this, Fred, one more thing on NATO. I do think that the Verschbau-Brzezinski plan is good, but not sufficient. I think, to go back to what the president said, we've got to have NATO, an agreement. They will be in NATO. Maybe it's not in 24 months, maybe it's not in 12 months, but we've got to put NATO in there. We don't want to try to push Ukraine into an Israel solution. And I hear that being discussed. That's not a lasting solution in Europe. That's a gray zone in Europe. They need to be in NATO. And we need to say it at the summit. I'm in France, and the French are telling me that France wants them in NATO. And the Americans are saying to the French, you're trying to escape your responsibilities by making us take your security responsibilities. So they believe that our administration is ducking the responsibility for bringing Ukraine into NATO. That's what I'm getting from French people associated with the leadership.
So I can share with this group, because President Zelensky allowed us to use this on the record, and John Herbst was there with me, John Rogers was, General Petraeus was in our meeting with Zelensky a couple of weeks ago. And he said that if NATO doesn't come further than it's agreed to come so far, and that included the Verschbau-Brzezinski piece, which I thought was quite good and forward-leaning, that he would not be able to come to Vilnius because he would consider it, because the Ukrainian people would consider it a betrayal of them. That there they are dying on the front lines in order to stop an authoritarian who threatens us all and threatens freedoms more generally, and that they really need a stronger sign and stronger security guarantees for him to actually come to the summit, which I thought was very interesting. It was in an off-record conversation. Then we went back to him later, and I asked whether I could use it on record, and his people said that they were willing to do that. So it's not that he's anti-NATO. I mean, without the U.S. and the U.S. support, he wouldn't be able to fight the war right now. But on the other hand, this is a difficult time for Ukraine as well, as you can well imagine. Let me continue to go down the line. Let me do John Herbst, and then President Kaljulaid, and then Angela, and then we'll close with Steve.
Okay, I would agree, Fred, with you that you watch Prigozhin very closely and watch Putin very closely. I'd also be looking for any statements coming from any of the Siloviki, Patrushev, Bortnikov. People are usually quiet, but see if there's any indication there. But the one place where you have people who are willing to talk is on Telegram and the Russian military bloggers, who have often been criticizing the way the war has been conducted, but not, in fact, the decision to go to war. So they are worth watching, because they can provide some indication of where developments may head.
Yeah, Prigozhin's statement on Telegram that the war wasn't worth fighting was the first major person who's done that. It's a very important thing that's gone out there. President Kaljulaid.
I wouldn't be watching Shoigu and Gerasimov. I think they are safer in their jobs for the next month than they have been for the last year, because Putin needs to save face, and giving in to Prigozhin would be really not something. I think I would watch whether Prigozhin is alive 2 weeks or a month from now, because the only way for Putin to reestablish that he is still strong vis-a-vis Russian people would be actually that he will be able to show that he was able to deal with Prigozhin in somehow. And he has to demonstrate it some way, somehow. If he's not able to do it, then I think we should really be watching, how Putin gets weaker and weaker, and who are the people who will then speak out against him. For example, Russian nationalists who have been strongly supporting the war in Moscow, really radical, you would say Russian neo-Nazi groups, have been yesterday also criticizing Putin. This is new. So things will continue. Putin will either be weakened or he will be able to demonstrate somehow that he has regained the upper arm. My guess is he will not be able to, so it will be kind of his power will be downgraded gradually, and then we will see something happening when the rest of the decision makers decide they can do without him. That is something which I think is the most probable. But Shoigu was inspecting the troops. He's been visible rather than before he wasn't, actually. So I think they are safe in their jobs for a couple of weeks.
Thank you so much. And we're down the last 3 minutes. So Angela and Steve, what will you be watching?
So I don't have very much to add. I am going to be watching whether Shoigu and Gerasimov stay in place, and they probably will. I will be watching to see whether Prigozhin resurfaces where he is. And I will, and again, I'll also be watching to see what the other, any of the Siloviki around Putin, what they're saying. And I'll be watching Putin too. Where does he appear? What does he say? What does he not say? And let me just add my 2 cents. I do not think that the Israel solution is the solution for Ukraine. Yeah. And I think it certainly has to get into NATO sooner rather than later.
It's too late to get into whether he appears or his body double appears, but that's been more and more frequent, by the way. But Steve.
I want to watch on what we do. First, my view is it's not Israel as a substitute for NATO, it's NATO membership plus the kind of support for Ukraine we give Israel. So my view, Wes, is it's NATO plus Israel. We need to try to get that out of Vilnius, but it needs to be a consensus among the alliance. And the message, I think, to the Russians is, if you don't like this direction this is heading, then get out of Ukraine. Secondly, I think we've got to watch whether the administration is going to take the advice from General Clark and General Scapparotti and really ramp up our support militarily for Ukraine so they can take advantage of the situation. And 3, monitoring Russian troop morale and everything we can do to encourage its undermining.
Thank you. What a terrific group of experts and speakers. I feel honored to work with this level of public servants in our International Advisory Board, on our board in general at the Atlantic Council. Thanks to everybody joining this quickly scheduled event. If you have ideas of people you'd like to hear from, other events you'd like to see, send them along to me by email or however else you want to reach them to me. But thanks for joining, and thanks to Steve and John Herbst and Kersti Kaljulaid, Angela Stent, Wes Clark, and Curtis Scapparotti. It's great to have you all as part of the Atlantic Council community. Thanks, and see you the next time.